good to see you. Some familiar faces, some new people. Good to have you all here. So my name is Neele van Bongardt. I wanted to welcome you tonight to the second lecture of our lecture series, What is the Anthropocene? I am from the Amsterdam Sustainability Institute, and together with Sjoerd, we are organizing this series. So today we talk about transitions. We have two speakers, and Sjoerd Kluiving, who will give an introduction to the topic as a whole. And with that, I would like to ask you to the floor.
Thank you, Neele. Also very welcome to this second lecture series of What is the Anthropocene, and our aim also to create a lot of collaboration between the different disciplines, and transition pathways is an excellent, I think, second choice in our series, also to bring about the research which is needed, also to bring us to another path, or maybe to another future. Let's see. Does it work, Neele? So I'm talking, yes, a lot of other lecture series. Yeah. Okay. I mean yeah. So today we have, of course, Mathieu and Kristiaan. Mathieu Blondeel, Kris Kok will introduce in a minute. Two pictures to show a little bit transition pathways. They are from Scientist Rebellion up in the left corner on the 8/12. That was on the Saturday, the first Saturday when there was a blockade. And on the right, on the lower right corner, you see the cortege of the about 50 scientists last Friday on the strike, Schools for Friday strike. Okay, last week there was an update in Science Advances by Richardson et al., the same group as Rockström et al. More than 14 years ago. They published the planetary boundaries. Planetary boundaries, we thought there were only 3 14 years ago, but now we overstepped 6 of the planetary boundaries, which is an enormous amount of more detail. And I think Kristiaan will talk about it as well next in his talk. But it means that we only have so much more space, so much overstepped our safe operating space, what is defined. And that's where definitely we need more transitions. So what's needed for a sustainable future? That's, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals. So these are the ones which are, you can list them also with people at the base, ecological, spiritual, SDGs on top of each other. Here at the VU, we have them ingrained in the sideways, and we can walk over them. But we also need to know, of course, how to bring them into practice. Okay, that's where we need transition. The definition of a transition, the old one, is a process of structural, non-linear, systemic change in dominant regime that takes place over a period of decades. So that is quite disappointing, of course, if you think about transitions. So you would also like them to have them act more fast. Well, we learn today, of course, it takes more time to take a transition. Dirk Loorbach, he's one of the Drift authors also. He says sort of forward stumbling. You take 1 step before, and then you take 2 steps behind, and then maybe 2 steps more, and then 1 step behind. That's a sort of dynamics which fits maybe transition. We'll hear more about that also from Kris and from Mathieu. So transition pathways, I built on we need to expect a period of enormous crisis, and also around raw materials, energy, climate, and which also have repercussion on the economy. And paradoxically, they also feed our hope to a sustainable future. That's what Jan Rotmans said. So he says that 10 systemic transitions are needed. That's from his book, Omarm the Chaos. It's energy, and it's raw materials, and it's circular. And these are also being discussed by Mathieu in the first talk. And they are real connected. You cannot have the one without the other. And basically, it's true for more of these, the food, agriculture, food transition, the spatial and financial transition, they're all connected. You cannot have one without the other. You need to have more. And we'll see it also from the talks today. that most of the researchers are working with multiple transitions. And what to say about educational transition, a healthcare transition, we need a social transition, and above all, we need a democratic, a political transition as well. So you could be very, a bit sad maybe about the outlook of so many different transitions. This is how scientists, transition scientists, break it up, and Jan Holtmans also lists them. And he says it's also our hope for our sustainable future. So how do transitions work? This is the famous X curve of Drift. Drift is a Dutch research for transitions at Erasmus University in Rotterdam. And they basically, they say that we need to have the old industry breaking down and phase out eventually. At the same time, we have new events coming up, industry coming up, and institutions stabilize at the future. So this is the typical structure of a transition, how it works. And so we can have different stages, also 1.0, 2.0 to 3.0. Would be interesting to discuss maybe where 4.0 ends in this transition work. Okay, so some general personal comments from Dirk Loorbach from a previous presentation he held. So we need to be systemic, radical on the long term, diplomatic on the short term, have backcasting, envisioning also scenarios, instruments for change, focus on change agents, be selective, have front runners to create transformative networks, but also be adaptive and also learning by doing and doing by learning. Ensure monitoring and reflexivity. So a lot of governance principles we can maybe touch upon later, or these are at the end of the hour. Okay, so this is my short introduction. With that, I want you to be warmed up a little bit to the speakers. Neele is going to introduce them. Neele.
Yes, thank you, Sjoerd. So here you can also see we have more coming up. In 2 weeks, we'll also have Niels, for example, present. But now we'll first turn towards the energy transition and invite Mathieu Blondeel to the stage. Mathieu is an assistant professor at the IVM, that's the Institute for Environmental Studies here at the VU. And he focuses mainly on the intersection of global energy and climate politics, and especially the geopolitics of the energy system transformations. So he'll tell us a bit more about geopolitical drivers and barriers to the transformation. And just we can stage the audience. Change the.
Yes. All right. Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening. It's good to see so many people here. We have less competition from the weather, of course, than 2 weeks ago. So thanks for being here. I'll try to stick to my 20 minutes, but I'm an academic still, so I love to talk. But I want to hear from you guys as well. And all right, so I'll be talking about energy, geopolitics, and transformation in the Anthropocene, which is quite a mouthful, of course, and I'll explain in a minute a little bit what I mean with all these terms about energy transformations, energy geopolitics, etc. But maybe so I'll talk a bit about that. But the main focus of the talk here today, or at least in my introduction in the first 20 minutes, I do want to talk a little bit about the barriers and challenges associated with the energy transformation at a more aggregate global level. So that's why I'm talking about geopolitics. This isn't. I do have to click with the mouse only. All right. So maybe first things first, a little bit of a backgrounder as to, okay, why do we actually need this energy transformation in a global context? Sjoerd already showed this graph that if you've been following the news in the past couple of weeks or so, you've probably seen this already. We have officially, at least according to some scientists that have done the research, trespassed 6 of the planetary boundaries now, of course. And it isn't really looking that good. And if you really read the paper, and I definitely can advise you to, it's a little bit of a punch in the gut. if you will, to read everything that's been going on. But anyway, so this is basically the Anthropocene, right? This is what we're talking about when we're talking about the Anthropocene. And when we're talking about energy, the energy system, the global energy system, basically touches on a variety of the different boundaries that we've crossed. But of course, today here, I'll be focusing on climate change because I think that's a primary boundary that we have to think about when we think about the negative impacts, if you will, of the global energy system. So again, a brief reminder as to why we need energy system transformation. There it is. And the link between the energy system and climate change. If you look at this graph from the International Energy Agency, you'll see that basically in our energy system or our energy supply at a global level, at an aggregate level, fossil fuels still account for a little over 80% of our total energy supply. Okay, and this actually hasn't really changed that much. We're all talking about the energy transition, energy transformation, but in the past couple of decades, this hasn't changed that much. If you compare this to 1973, just before the first big global energy crisis, the oil crisis, that was 87%. So in a time span of 50 years or so, this only has decreased by 7 percentage points. That's simply not enough, especially if you know that, and this is the IPCC Working Group 1 in their report that was published in 2021, they found that in the past 10 years, the combustion of oil, coal, and natural gas, our three main fossil fuels, of course, has contributed to 86% of CO2 emissions. Okay, so we know the link, the dominance of fossil fuels in our global energy system. We know the link between the combustion of fossil fuels. So we know the link between fossil fuels and, of course, climate change. And that is why we need, at a global scale, at a global level, this energy system transformation, of course. Right. Now, what is energy system transformation? Sjoerd has already explained that Jan Holtmans has said we need, or one of the 10 transitions that we need is an energy transition. But what is an energy transition? And I think it's really important to understand that we know what an energy transition, or as I call it, energy system transformation, basically entails. Because I think that if you really want to think about it in an intricate way, you kind of need to distinguish between two different energy transitions that are taking place at the same time. There's one transition that is what I call a low carbon transition, which basically is a transition that entails an uptake of renewables in our global energy mix. So demand for renewables, dominated largely by wind and solar energy, of course, needs to go up significantly and very rapidly. That's depicted here, of course, in the with the orange line. But then at the same time, and that is really crucial, and that is something that is less talked about, is we also need a high carbon transition. It's not enough to just add renewables to our global energy mix. We also very quickly need to phase out demand and production of fossil fuels as well. So that is the second transition that is taking place, a high carbon transition, a transition away from a high carbon fossil fuel dominated global energy system. And these are two actually distinct transitions, of course. Of course, they're linked to one another. They're intertwined, if you will. They collide, they overlap, they're married to each other. They fight also, which is, I guess, what happens in marriages as well. But anyway, so you need both transitions at the same time. They have their own dynamics. They have their own political, economic, social, cultural, technical dynamics as well. But that's really important to understand that we have two transitions happening at the same time. They overlap, they have similarities, but there are also very much differences between the two. And I'll talk a little bit, they both have their own opportunities and challenges, and I'll talk a little bit about the challenges associated with both transitions as well, particularly about the high carbon transition. One way in which you can think about the challenges associated with these transitions is through the concept of energy security. And basically, energy security is what every energy decision maker is concerned with. Because you have to, bring together or strive for the balance between three different objectives that you have. The first one is in your energy supply, your energy needs to be available. At all times, you need to make sure that demand for energy is always met by supply of energy. That is the first element, of course, that you need. And that is something that will be put under pressure, of course, if you're transitioning away from certain fossil fuels that you have now, because the idea still is that fossil fuels are abundantly available, so that there's a constant supply in order to meet demand for fossil fuels. Okay. But then the second element is, okay, theoretically, it's all well and good that you have sufficient energy available, of course, but if you cannot afford it as a consumer, as a household, as a family, as a company, as an industry, then what good is it that it's there, theoretically speaking, right? So the energy also has to be affordable at the same time as being available. And that is kind of what happened with the energy crisis in the past winter. If you will, there was enough energy available, it was just ridiculously expensive. Right? And this is a very classic way of looking at energy security. So a constant supply of energy at affordable prices so that demand is constantly met by supply. But there is a third element if you really want to think holistically and in a complex way about energy security, and that's sustainability. And also sustainability understood in a very, if you will, well, holistic sense as well, because sustainability is more than just climate change, right? It's also, well, environmental spills of, oil drilling, for example. It's also about the social circumstances and labor rights associated with the people that work in coal mines, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so energy security is a really important notion here in the context of the energy transition or the energy system transformation, because you constantly have to balance all these three security dimensions at the same time. And that is why it's also often called an energy trilemma, because it's very difficult, if not almost impossible, to basically achieve all three objectives at the same time. And that is where this notion of energy geopolitics also comes in, because we're living in a region, for example, in Europe, where energy, oil and gas and coal to a lesser extent isn't abundantly available. And in order to meet all three objectives, and specifically the first two, of course, of availability and affordability, we're actually, we need to import energy. And we're, of course, dependent on different countries, different regions, different suppliers of energy in order to meet our energy goals, our energy security goals. And so this is the definition. I'm not going to read it for you guys because I assume that you can all read. But this is what energy geopolitics is about. It's about this interaction between actors' attempt to achieve all three objectives at the same time and geographical constraints that are simply there, physical constraints. Really important here, it's about two elements that I really want to single out, because geopolitics is often talked about in terms of, okay, it's how geography drives politics. I think it's the other way around. It's not just the other way around. I think it's more of a two-way street, because I think politics can also drive, geographical, if you will, geographical spaces, or politics can be space making. If you see at, or if you look at how changing political relations between the European Union and the United States on the one hand, and China on the other, is also changing geographies of trade. You see that politics can also drive geography, of course. And geopolitics is often also coined in terms of how great states or great powers compete over access to scarce resources. But it's not just about great powers. It's not just about the United States and the European Union. Other states matter also in the global energy system. Indonesia matters, Saudi Arabia matters, Venezuela matters as well. They're not, well, we cannot consider these to be great powers, of course. And then also, it's not just about states. I think there's enough people here in the room that understand that international politics isn't just about governments engaging with one another. It's also organized civil society. It's also multinational corporations that all have a big impact on the global energy system, of course. Now I do, I'm probably already, yeah, I do have some time. Okay, that's great. I do want to focus on one case study very briefly. I want to develop this in order to kind of, you know, tease you guys a little bit about how we can think about the energy transition in the context of well, geopolitics and energy security as well. And that's the case, of course, of critical minerals. Most of you have already heard about critical minerals. We're talking about cobalt, we're talking about lithium, copper, nickel, rare earth elements, etc. All types of minerals, metals that will be used in low carbon technologies, such as wind turbines, such as batteries for electric vehicles, such as solar panels, etc., etc. And so these critical minerals, there's very much of a geopolitical angle to them. Because, and I'll show you the slide in a minute as well, the way in which the concentration, or the way in which there is a geographical concentration across the entire supply chain of these critical minerals, that really gives you a geopolitical angle already. And I think we often talk about supply chains, and maybe that's something that we can pick up in a discussion afterwards as well. We really need to understand or take apart the notion of a global supply chain. What is a global supply chain? Because when we're talking about fossil fuels, we mostly focus on extraction, right? The extraction takes, for example, place of natural gas in the United States, in Qatar, in Australia. Comes here, then you don't really have to do anything with it. You can inject it directly, your natural gas, into a, for example, a gas-fired power plant. But these critical minerals, their supply chains is something it's a lot more intricate, it's a lot more detailed to understand. And if you want to conceptualize it, there's 3 steps in the entire process. There's the extraction of mineral ore, which isn't very useful, of course. Then you need to refine it, you need to process it in order that it becomes an actual usable mineral. And then you need to use that mineral. For example, the cobalt goes into an electric vehicle battery. Then you need to, of course, build the battery. And you also need to build, of course, the electric vehicle. So it's important to understand that the global supply chains already of these critical minerals is something different from the global supply chain, if you will, of oil and gas. Okay, so it's a lot more intricate, it's a lot more detailed, it's a lot more complex as well. And of course, geographical control or geographical choke points, if you will, of these critical minerals create issues around availability and affordability. Because if everything or a lot of it is located in one country, and if you look at, for example, how the video is just there. But can anyone guess, before you do it, Neele, can anyone guess how much of global total production of cobalt the DRC holds? 80. It's actually less, it's 70. Damn it. But yeah, it's 70, which is quite a lot. You have to understand that. So the DRC alone controls a little under double the amount, or let's put it differently because it's too complex to say it like that. The 3 biggest producers of oil. So that is the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Russia together. They control around 40% of total global oil production. So for this critical mineral, cobalt, which is used, of course, in batteries for electric vehicles, the DRC alone holds 70%. And if you look at different critical minerals, for Indonesia, for example, holds a bigger sway over nickel production than those 3 producers hold over oil production at the global level. So you see that this concentration of power also holds issues in terms of, well, what happens if a country X, for example, the DRC, decides to limit exports for X or Y reason, right? So this might impact further down the supply chain and raises issues around affordability and availability. Availability, of course, if you limit the supply, prices go up. That's economics 101, right? But also sustainability. I mean, I don't have the time also to explain you in which circumstances this cobalt is being extracted in Eastern Congo, but I can advise you to read the book Red Cobalt by an American investigative journalist, and then you'll read some of the most horrific things imaginable. And I think one of the most poignant comparisons that author made, and I'm Belgian, he says, well, it reminded me of the practices under Leopold II in the Congo, where at the time, as you may know, rubber was particularly interesting to extract. Now, talking about availability and affordability and concentration of supplies, this is the, the EV supply chain. And you see that there's one country very dominant in the supply chain, of course, and that's China, right? So this raises a lot of issues about, again, availability, affordability, and also the context in which everything is happening, because we are working in a changing geopolitical environment in which the European Union and the United States, again, on the one hand, and China, Russia, if you will, on the other hand, are increasingly engaging with one another in a very conflictual, or better said, competitive environment. So if the Chinese control these or have such a concentration of power over the supply chain, what impacts does this have on the speed of the energy transformation here in Europe as well? Because the Chinese can easily say in a matter, say, for example, a conflict breaks out over Taiwan, for example, and the Chinese start blocking exports of critical minerals to Europe. What effect will this have on the speed and nature of the energy transformation? And this isn't something that I'm just inventing here now. It's a real world risk that might happen, and it might be something similar to what the Russians did in the context of the war in Ukraine, when they just simply turned off the gas tap for the gas that was coming to Europe. Now, I know I don't have enough time. Something that is really important also in the context of, the material impacts and the Anthropocene, etc. Of course, a lot of issues, a lot of risks, a lot of challenges, but important to understand in terms of sustainability, etc. And in terms of the transitions that Sjoerd was already talking about, there are some opportunities associated with this transformation as well, because this shows you that basically the cumulative amount of minerals and metals that we need between now and 2050 in steel, aluminum, copper, nickel, graphite, etc., critical minerals, is less than the amount of coal that we extract on a yearly basis. So the cumulative amount of all these materials is less than what we need on a yearly basis of coal. So yes, the impact is massive of this system, of this transformation, but when it comes to this critical materials transformation, there are some important opportunities there as well. And then I haven't talked about circularity yet, in terms of, okay, if we can actually succeed in increasing the circularity of these materials, because today in Europe, we only recycle 1% of the lithium that we use in electric vehicles. We recycle less than 20% of the cobalt that we use in electric vehicle batteries. So if we can increase that circular transition, if we can improve that, then there are some opportunities associated with that. I'm unfortunately going to have to leave it at that. I knew I was going to talk for too long, but maybe some interesting or food for thought, hopefully, for the discussion afterwards. And thank you very much for being here. Yeah. If you have questions.
Yeah, so we have also some time for questions now, and also have a discussion later. So if you have something urgent, back over for clarification.
Or if you want to give me 2 more minutes.
Yeah, well.
I couldn't help but notice on the first graph you showed, maybe if you, sorry. So on the first graph you showed, we had the high carbon transition, but it never goes to zero. So what's like the consequence of that, or what does that mean for your story?
This is just a very simple graphical depiction of what this would look like in graphic terms. This double transformation, and I do have to say it's taken from the Shell security scenarios. But the interesting thing about it is that even Shell, in their internal reports, it's not an internal report, of course, it's a report that they also publish, of course, and they understand that this is a double transformation that is taking place. So yeah, there are implications, of course, associated with the fact that we would never go to zero in their scenarios,
but I think that is also something that Kristiaan could talk a little bit about. But it also, it relates to the other land system transition that I think we talked about earlier today, that, okay, if it doesn't go to zero, we're going to have to offset all these emissions associated with the fossil fuel combustion that continues. What does that mean in terms of, for example, reforestation? But anyway, yeah, it is from Shell.
And if I can have a slight second question that may be more rhetorical, but yes, there is less coal needed than all the minerals needed, right? In the last case that you showed. But what does a Congolese person has to that message? And what's it's also kind of weird to trade human lives linked to it. So I wonder if that's also, I know this is a discussion going on. Yeah. Just your reflection on that.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think that's something that you do definitely need to take into account. And that's one of, I think, the downsides of taking a more aggregate geopolitical view on the transition, of course, is that you lose individual stories or stories at a level closer to home. But I guess if you talk about if we're talking about it in terms of Anthropocene and geopolitical global impacts, then I think it does matter to actually showcase that yes, there are absolutely risks at different levels associated with increased reliance on these critical minerals, but there are also some positives to it. But of course, I fully understand this criticism, absolutely.
And aren't you also?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. You can leave it there. First, we're talking about geopolitics. You didn't mention anything about justice here, and also what you said in the beginning, from the 73, it was 87%, and now it's 80% the fossil fuel, but still 1 billion people don't have energy in the global south. So how we deal with that in this transition, and also what extent this urgency that we agree there is an urgency is also not leading to early lock-ins in extractive technologies like cobalt and lithium. So why should we go for batteries to begin with?
Major question, but very true indeed. I think, again, one of the shortcomings of taking such a geopolitical perspective, and especially from a very classic perspective when you talk about geopolitics in terms of, again, great power competition over access to scarce resources, that's a very limited discussion, because as I said, you only talk about the US versus China or Russia versus Europe, right? And it leaves out a lot of other players in the international game. I think that's one. And justice, I do think that justice comes in here to a certain extent, because this shift, this transformation also provides the possibility of gaining more geopolitical leverage and power for a country like the DRC, for example, if they would succeed in actually taking ownership of the extractive processes of these types of minerals, in their case, cobalt. And of course, if you do this as a national government or regional governments in the eastern provinces, with the specific aim of ensuring that your workers can develop at the social level as well. And I'm not saying that's happening right now, but there is a potential for these types of lower income or low income countries and middle income countries to actually get a seat around the energy table and get a seat around the geopolitical table. And to a certain extent, and perhaps this is a very different way of thinking about justice in a global context, I think this is already a form of potential justice for these types of countries. Talking about batteries and the extraction of these minerals, of course, I'm fully convinced of the idea that we don't have to trade every internal combustion engine for an electric vehicle. Of course, I think it's really important to understand that when you're thinking about transformation, it's not just a technical transformation, it's a more holistic transformation, as Sjoerd already showed with Rotman's 10 types of transitions, that you need to have a more comprehensive understanding of what the transformation entails with an entire rethinking of a mobility system and a mobility sector here in the Netherlands, but also at an aggregate European level, where the focus is much more, we call it, what's it called, the multimodal shift, right? Where their focus is much more on public transportation and a lot less on private car ownership, for example. Because if we're just going to switch, indeed, reliance on internal combustion engines to electric engines, then we're not going to get there, or electric vehicles. Absolutely.
Yeah. So a lot more to discuss. So thank you very much, Mathieu, for this great overview. And with that, we come to our second speaker, Kristiaan Kok from the Athena Institute, where he is an assistant professor of politics and governance of sustainability transitions. And he mainly focuses on understanding power, justice, and democracy in sustainability transitions. So there we have that part. And the role of transdisciplinary experiments as governance instruments in bringing about societal change. And empirically, you look a lot in agri-food systems. So we'll have a closer look now at another transition pathway. So.
Thank you. You have the clicking thing?
Clicking thing.
Thank you. Thank you. So great to see you all, and thanks for the lovely introduction. I wanted to talk about food system transformation, and more specifically about governing transitions towards just and sustainable food systems. And as was already mentioned, food is one of the crucial elements of our lives and also one of those systems in need of transformation. And even though in the last decades, the food systems in our world have been very successful in some regards, increasing crop production, providing food and nutrition security to many people, there are also some issues. This is also what food systems look like in the Anthropocene. And the challenges are manifold and interlinked, just as in the energy system and all other societal systems, of course. But there are a couple of main reasons, in my view, why there's an urgent need for transitions in food systems. First of all, they are major drivers for environmental pollution. Food systems account for, I think, somewhere between, depending on how you calculate it, 25 and 37% of greenhouse gas emissions. There are severe coupled health and socioeconomic challenges. Think about all the issues regarding the obesity pandemic, malnutrition in many parts of the world. And at the same time, climate change that is already happening affects the performance of our current food systems, leading to droughts, etc. And this is not just a view, this is all there in the IPCC report. Just to make sure we're all on board what we mean by food systems, it's not just the agricultural system. Food systems is the whole interplay of agricultural systems, from production, distribution, preparation, also processing of foods, to the consumption. And especially adopting a food systems perspective means focusing on the interconnections between these different elements. You could visualize it like this, especially if you like circular ways of thinking. So from food production all the way to healthy people and then waste streams. This is one of the ways the European Commission likes to depict it nowadays. In reality, it looks a bit more like this. So good luck with transforming it. But today, maybe in about 15, 18 minutes, we know how to do the trick, or maybe not. First, I wanted to highlight a little bit more about the issue of transitions and what it means in food systems. Then I want to focus on governing not only environmentally sustainable, but also socially just transitions in food systems. And then we'll touch upon the topic of transition pathways. And I want to conclude by reflecting a bit and thinking about what it means for the types of research that we conduct on transitions, especially in food systems. So let's start off with a positive note. There is widespread momentum for the realization that we need transitions in food systems. Much of that momentum is happening in scholarly debates, people working on agricultural systems, climate change scholars, policy scientists. There's a whole community, epistemic community around food system transformation. I myself identify a bit with the transition studies community. That's why I underlined it. There, of course, there's also a notion that we need to transform food systems, but also on the political level and on the policy side. There was the UN Food Systems Summit. There's the EU Green Deal, which has a very strong food component, the farm to fork strategy with very ambitious targets. Of course, we still need to see how it works out in practice. And then even in the Dutch context, there are policies formulated on circular agriculture, all kinds of strategies, embracing this notion of transitions. However, there's also a lot of resistance. We just saw great pictures of the protests last week, but 2 years ago, a couple of years ago, there were also these types of protests, farmers protesting against changes in agricultural production. So to briefly dive into what transitions mean, Sjoerd already mentioned it's long-term processes. It can take several decades before they materialize, of fundamental change. So that's different than new technologies, introducing new innovations. It's fundamental change in the ways we think, in the ways we do, and in the ways we organize our societal systems. And that means that it's not just about realizing technological innovation, but it's about the co-evolution between introducing new technologies, new policies to support them, to create new markets or alternative economic models, and to make sure that they also represent important sociocultural values. So, for instance, in food system transitions, when you think about agricultural transition in the previous century towards modernized production, it's not just enough to have like new machines to work on the land, but it also requires this central value that food security is the most important thing to focus on. And then there needs to be policies that support skill-intensive agricultural practices like the Common Agricultural Policy. And then now we have a problem in our food systems. So it's the connection between agricultural production systems, consumption patterns, and, for instance, food environments that we're talking about. And what I really liked also about Mathieu's and Sjoerd's introduction and presentation is that it also really requires breaking down incumbent systems. So I feel that the tendency in scholarly debate in the last couple of decades had been about supporting the scaling up of new innovations and new initiatives. But this breaking down, as we also saw in the X curve, is a really crucial element. And it's also an element that governments and politicians don't really like. Think about, for instance, breaking down, let's say, some subsidies and policy schemes that subsidize almost 45 billion euros in fossil fuels. It's very difficult for some reason to get rid of those elements. Another reason why change is difficult is because these systems are very complex, and in complex systems, they tend to co-evolve towards more or less stable states, which is generally a good thing because it means, for instance, that systems remain somewhat stable over time, but it also means that we are now stuck with systems that have some kind of undesirable resilience, which makes it quite difficult to really change them, especially as current power relations strongly reproduce the incumbent system. So transition scholars have called for multi-actor, multi-level governance approaches. So includes civil society, researchers, citizens, policymakers all together, and try to find those leverage points in the system that will give us the most potential for change. But this, of course, is not easy. And here, the X curve. Can I also point? Yeah, nice. So I'm not entirely sure where we are in the food system transition. Maybe somewhere a bit here in the chaos part. And though we realize that we need to go somewhere, I think it's still a bit of a question, where do we want to go? So what is this goal and how do we want this future to look like? And this is also where I think an important element comes in, and that is justice. So yes, we need rapid climate action to make sure that we stay within the, or even go back within the safe operating space. But at the same time, if we create transition dynamics that does not lead to a more just society, we have maybe an even bigger problem. And it's not self-evident that sustainability transitions also lead to socially just outcomes. For instance, you can think of all kinds of highly technological innovations, maybe cultured meat or something else. That is something that we do not want because we don't find it ethically right. You can think about new ways of agricultural production that might be environmentally sustainable, but lead to an increase in food prices, especially for marginalized and vulnerable communities. Or what about us in Europe making policies and creating sustainable food systems, but then in other parts of the world, there are negative side effects. So these types of dynamics are really important to take into account. And luckily, there are many people who already for decades thought about social justice and how to also differentiate between different elements of justice. So let me briefly highlight a couple. So when you think about just transitions, it's about distributive justice. So how are the benefits and the burdens of these transitions distributed across communities, across ecosystems? There will be actor groups, companies, or communities that lose out. And the question is, how do we compensate? There's procedural justice. Who gets to participate in transition processes? Who decides in which direction we want these food systems to evolve? There's recognition justice. Which perspectives or concepts do we find important, and how do we balance these out? And increasingly, you also see calls for restorative justice, which is restoring the historical injustices that have been done. And in food systems, this is also very evident because they have very strong spatial connections and also a deeply colonial history. So when you think about just transitions, it is also about, yes, making sure that the transitions that we set in motion do not lead to injustice, or that we compensate for the injustices that might emerge, but maybe more fundamentally, it is also an opportunity to make society more just. And I think that's maybe also a positive connotation. But then, of course, the question emerges, what about transition pathways? For me, the question on transition pathways is a question of how to get where. Which means that, yes, scaling up of innovations is really important, not only technological innovation, but also social innovations, policy innovations. But it is also about directing these pathways towards a vision, a desired outcome of the transition process. And for food systems, it could be that we envision agroecology as the main form of agricultural production. It could also be, and other people argue in favor of sustainable intensification. So the direction that we take is quite contested. And another important notion here, and Sjoerd already mentioned this experimental notion of transition governance. And one of the challenges is that, yes, we need those experiments, we need innovations, but we also need to connect them to strong policies, especially now the time is running out. And if you then look at these transition pathways also with a justice perspective, it also means that we need to engage all types of local communities in determining the direction of innovation and determining the direction of transformation. It means that we need to find new ways of organizing democratically. And maybe that also means that we need to include voices that are never represented in our traditional democracies, for instance, the voice of nature. So how can we do that? How can we try and find ways of broadening up perspectives? And it might also mean that when you think about it from a distributive perspective, that these transitions should redistribute wealth and resources across communities, and especially those already affected by incumbent food systems. For me, the confusing thing about transition pathways is that we can always support multiple. which is also good, I think. I don't think that necessarily transitions need to lead to one particular future, but we can create a plurality of futures in which there is a diversity of food system elements. But the question is, how do we combine them and how can we build pathways that are both sustainable and just? And that, I think, is still a challenge for the field. Especially as it seems as if in the debates on food system transformation, there are roughly two camps or two visions. And I think both hold a valuable contribution. And the first one emphasizes that there's a need for rapid acceleration of climate action. And often that is combined with highly technological transition pathways. For instance, focusing on digital agriculture, green growth, those kinds of concepts. And on the other hand, you have more of a justice-oriented community who are advocates for just food system transitions, democratization. And I think the issue at hand is that it's a bit of a paradox. We need both because the justice perspectives do something valuable that is opening up, providing a diversity of perspectives. And the acceleration perspective closes down towards the direction. And in some way, we need to find ways to combine these two different approaches. And when we think a bit more about this paradox, or maybe the contradiction between directionality and diversity in food system transformation pathways, directionality asks questions like which future food systems are supported by transition governance, for instance. And then you can think of a whole bunch of ways on how we can think about it. We can move towards agroecological futures. If we don't do anything and business as usual happens, it would be a very bad outcome, but it might be the direction that we're actually heading towards. And then there are also options for degrowth and all kinds of grassroots alternatives. And then there's the issue of diversity, which also comes in many forms and shapes. We might need a diversity of crop systems because it enhances the resilience of our production. We want a diversity of actors, communities, and knowledge involved in transition processes. We want maybe a diversity of food system functionalities. Food has cultural value. It offers employment. There is, of course, a need because we need to eat. There are health issues, economic issues. So balancing these, I think, is one of the challenges of our field right now, and also challenges for implementation. So let me conclude by reflecting a bit on the role of research. And I'm not sure if we're all researchers, but probably a lot of us are. And I think this image of the complexity also is a nice illustration of the case that I would like to make. And that is that food systems research also needs to take into account multiple types of knowledge and multiple values, because we're never going to understand this system if we do not include perspectives from others, because we want to know the system from this position and from here and from there and from there and from there. And at the same time, it means that research can also be governance intervention. So we can not only study these types of systems, but also actively engage in transformation processes through transdisciplinary research, where we involve the societal stakeholders, citizens, farmers, etc., in the research process. And for me, it has three important reasons: to identify transition pathways together, to evaluate whether the policies or governance efforts we set in motion actually work, but also to build new transition pathways. So I know that this lecture series is an excellent opportunity for exactly this, to build transdisciplinary collaborations between different researchers here and maybe also societal stakeholders or partners that we work with in the field. But this is not a tick-the-box activity. It's not an easy task because it also comes with the need to acknowledge our own position and values. From which perspective are we engaging with food systems research? What kind of concepts do we use and how political is that? Do we already give some hints at directions, or do we even force directions by the concepts that we adopt in our research? I think these are important things to think about. So one example on how we can do this, and at the Athena Institute, we do this type of work a lot, and I think at IVM as well, and maybe also at other institutes, work a lot with living labs, which are multi-stakeholder spaces. So we give a bit of a protected space where we work with citizens, farmers, researchers on developing transition pathways together. And in a way, we experiment there in a bit of a safe environment. And there are all kinds of outcomes that these transdisciplinary processes yield. For instance, new innovations, shared visions, policy roadmaps. But also they can be very concrete. And I see Camilla's in the room. We have a project, we're doing a project together with partners in Wageningen, which is called Crop Mix. This project is about transition pathways towards mixed cropping systems. So the idea that you don't have, and that as well, not a monocultural field, but you have strip cropping. So you have cabbage, and then you have carrots, and then you have potatoes, and you have cabbage again. And that might be a bit of an easier pathway than, for instance, agroecology. And whether it works or not, we don't really know, but we're trying to find out. And farmers in that project will also implement new ways of mixed cropping. So that's an example of how this type of research works. Some final considerations. So the first one I already mentioned. So I think it's really important to think about which kind of concepts we maybe implicitly promote through the work that we do. What kind of values we put in our models? What kind of assumptions are there when we talk about agroecology, about dietary change, about an obesity pandemic, for instance? Another challenge is that this also requires us to adopt new roles. We have to facilitate, we have to intervene, and this is challenging. And not only is it challenging, it might also be a bit of a burden on ourselves, because suddenly we don't just have to do research, but we have to make the world a better place. We have to make sure that transitions are just. And how do we do that? So how do we engage? There's also quite some unknowns, I would say, in whether this type of research actually yields transformation. You mentioned Dirk Borbach in the beginning. He was in my thesis defense committee, and the first thing he said was, Kris, I haven't seen a transition yet. So how do we know that all these types of efforts that we embark on actually work? I mean, of course, there are many frameworks for assessing. Many people have thought about it. But it is something that is a bit of an uncertainty for us if we engage in these processes. Can we actually create the change we hope to see? And how do we engage with other actors in the field? If we organize these living labs, do we let Big Agri join? Do we let Shell join? Well, I think at VU we just decided we don't. But so that also means that we need to think differently about the way we have organized science. That's basically my final reflection, because I see Neele already standing here. These are some questions you might want to think about or reflect upon during the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah. So again, we have some time for questions for this presentation. Otherwise, we just enter right into the discussion.
Yes, I was wondering about, first of all, I work for the city of Amsterdam. Yes.
Yes, we are a multi-stakeholder community here.
Yeah. And I was wondering about the whole part about stopping, breaking something down.
Yes.
I mean, in the whole X curve, it's parallel to building something up. But I was actually wondering, isn't it kind of pointless? Don't we first have to stop to create the urgency to replace it with something else? Because otherwise we're just trying to get an alternative that's just as good or better than what we do right now.
Yeah.
And that's never going to happen, because by default, it's always more expensive. It's always not right there yet. Yeah. So I think we first need to stop and then build something new.
I think that's a really good question, and I don't know the answer. I think ideally, it's indeed a bit of a marriage, it goes hand in hand, because if you break down, there's also, and it's an opportunity and a risk. if you break down maybe too fast without building up, then energy security, food security might be jeopardized. It's also one of the arguments used by people who lobby against transformation, but it is a relatively important thing to take into account. But I think, yes, to a certain degree, creating this chaos basically offers opportunities. And it is also a bit of a, maybe we need to get out of the comfort zone a little bit, because the lack of structure, the lack of norms, all this uncertainty is very uncomfortable for us as a society. But it might be exactly what is needed to push the transformation through. Yeah.
I have a question around, I guess the best way of putting it is that it's about greed and mistrust and how that leads to justice. So I know, for example, that the Dutch are looking to kind of bring the greenhouse technology to different parts of the world, but they're selling it. How does that work when we talk about just food systems and redressing some of the imbalances that you were talking about? Is that, there's no answer to this, but I just wanted to get your thoughts. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that's a really interesting point, and also really important example, which maybe shows that also when we talk about justice, there are trade-offs within, right? So in a way, it might be a just thing to do because you provide opportunities to work with new technologies. I don't know, but in a way, it might be just reproducing very unjust colonial histories, power dynamics. And I guess the only people who can determine whether it's just is the people who get the innovation or not. I don't know. It's difficult for me to put a judgment on it, I think. But I think these are exactly the types of trade-offs which make it so difficult. Because there are effects across space and scale, because there are trade-offs within considering social justice, because there are trade-offs between sustainability and justice. Different communities experience particular technologies differently. Yeah. But it's a really interesting discussion point. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. And then we can also maybe after this open up the journal. Yeah, maybe we can already. Yeah. I actually think if you just go with snack in that.
Oh,
This is my.
oh, okay.
It's beautiful. That's Yeah. Can I just say something about the breakdown? Because I think that's a really important point. But I mean, for me, it's a matter of coordinating that breakdown, right? Because if you look at it from an energy perspective as well, when we're breaking down a high carbon energy system, right? So the fossil fuel system, it needs to happen in a coordinated way, in the sense that you need to break down both demand and production of these fossil fuels. Because if you're just going to say, okay, let's leave fossil fuels in the ground, let's stop producing them, let's put a moratorium on the production of fossil fuels, which in an ideal situation, of course, happens. But if that isn't combined with a decrease in demand for fossil fuels and policies that help you reduce demand for fossil fuels, then we're just going to enter a situation that we've been in the past winter here in Europe, where supply of energy, supply of fossil gas, basically, was insufficient. And then you had an explosion in prices. And then you enter this notion of justice as well, because who's going to be affected most by the fact that you've decided at one point we're going to leave fossil fuels in the ground, we're going to halt production, but we're not going to simultaneously make sure that the reduction in demand is taking place as well. Well, then it's households, it's the people that can least afford it that will be affected the most. And then that whole notion of distributive justice, of course, is affected by it as well. And so I do think that it needs to be coordinated. And then the question becomes, okay, who coordinates that? Is it the state? I think, but what is the state? Right? But anyway, yeah. You are the state.
I guess I disagree, because now we are phasing out gas. At least we're trying way harder also at the city to make this happen because of the crisis, because of the chaos. if it all would be just coordinated, we would still be busy another 20 years or something. So the acceleration was because of the chaos. So you need to have that first. Then stuff will happen. And I totally agree with you. We need to sort of make it more just in the sense that we then, you know, give like that we support households that can't afford it. But without the chaos, we wouldn't have had the movement that we see now. That needs to come first.
Did we solve the chaos or did we just export the chaos? Because we could talk a lot about other regions in the world that were heavily affected by the way in which we here in Europe dealt with the gas prices by buying up all the LNG on the spot market. But again, that's a different discussion. But I do agree with you that perhaps we need a little bit of chaos in our lives.
Yeah, thank you very much for both presentations. Actually, my point is more a consideration that would apply to the energy transition as much as the food system transition. When talking about food system transition, as it applies also to energy, often there is a positive connotation with the idea of transformation and transition. But actually what we are experiencing in the global south is that there are perverse incentives really created by our incumbent dominant regimes, especially in Western countries, that simulate food system transition or even an energy transition that is actually backward. So how do we deal with these perverse incentives that we are creating? We are replicating things that were in our system, in our scale and geographical location in other parts of the world. Yeah. So it's, I must say, we can talk about the two different dimensions, but yeah, what can we do? I must say, I work a lot in the global south, and when I see what is happening, it really saddens me because, you know, we are making investments in those transitions, but actually we are creating the same chaos elsewhere where those problems didn't even exist.
Yeah. Yes. I fully agree, and thank you for raising this point, because I agree with you. Transitions have this positive connotation. But that's why I think it's really important that we focus on the directionality, because transitions are not necessarily always heading in right directions or directions that are desirable. And also, if they even happen in sustainable, ecologically sustainable directions, and still there are all kinds of negative side effects, and they might be distributed across space and scale. So maybe here it might work, and then the effect on the global south is again destructive. How to deal with it? Well, I do have the hope that, for instance, but this might be idle hope and is also not my area of expertise, but for instance, stuff like the UN Food System Summit would give these perspectives also platform. It hasn't really happened, but I do hope that through those kinds of international collaborations, hopefully at some point the global south gets more autonomy and doesn't get all these negative effects from whatever we produce here.
I was part of that summit.
Yeah.
The conversation actually took a different direction, and very urgent topics like food waste were totally neglected.
Yeah.
And also the linking of not just policies, but the agenda of climate change and food systems was not there.
No.
You start thinking, like, if we take all these parallel routes, and there are all these many investments, all these parallel platforms, the chaos is just getting bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
So managing the complexity, we all know it's very challenging. But, I think we are stimulating pathways that are not so sustainable because of that distribution effect.
Yeah.
So we may have wonderful results as a city of Amsterdam, but actually maybe what that implies for others. I mean, having this kind of awareness and acknowledgement of the trade-offs we are creating by doing transformations, I think it's something that is not yet there.
Yep.
Also, I noticed talking to different stakeholders that often people feel more comfortable with the concept of transition and not the one of transformation, though the two are used often in an equal way, which is not. because transition somehow is like moving a little bit farther than business as usual, as long as we tweak here and there. And transformation opens up like, wow, we have to reconsider.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, I must say, I really would like to continue this conversation.
Yes, please. Yeah. The power of concepts then. Yeah.
Indeed, this is why knowledge and concepts are so fundamental, because they establish the entire agenda. Once you put a stamp on it, that is what the different platforms will start using.
Yeah.
Okay, we have another question here, and then there might also be time afterwards for maybe a discussion.
Thanks for inviting us tonight about transition pathways in the Anthropocene. And though I was wondering a little bit, also judging from the transition pathways in energy systems, but both in the food systems, you talked about energy security and food security. But this is still about humans, right? So I was wondering, how do we incorporate ecocentric values in transition pathways, and should we do that?
Yeah, I think you are right. Food nutrition security is still focused on humans. I also think it's a very important thing to take into account, given the fact that we have so much malnutrition and also the obesity pandemic. But I think you're absolutely right. We should move beyond the whole human focus and reconnect human-nature relationships. And I think one of the key problems in the way that transition policies are being formulated, but also in general policy is formulated, it's from this anthropocentric perspective. So we read, and that's why I also gave the example of, can we find ways of including the voice of nature or animals in thinking about food system transitions? Because I think it's crucial, because we talk about planetary health and yeah. Thank you.
I actually disagree with you. I think we don't talk enough about humans, especially when it comes to the impact of climate change, especially here in Western Europe in particular. We're still talking about climate change and energy transition, but especially climate change then in terms of CO2 emissions, in terms of CO2 parts per million, fossil fuels. These are very in that the 2 degrees Celsius, 1.5 degrees Celsius, what does that mean? I don't know what it means. I don't know what the difference is between 1.5 and 2 degrees. Half a centigrade, I don't know. Carbon budgets, etc., etc. So these are very abstract terms, and I think it's really important in order to speak to a wider audience of less knowledgeable academic people to actually make this very tangible, very visible for people to, join us, an engaged academic community in this. You need to make it very human-centric. You need to make it tangible. You need to make sure that you convey a clear message that if we continue to combust fossil fuels at the rate that we're doing today, these extreme weather events that impact us very clearly already will only accelerate and exacerbate in the near future. So I think that we do need to make our message very human-centric and very tangible in order to make sure that people outside of the ivory tower actually also feel the urgency of the matter.
Yeah, maybe continuing on the discussion also on the human, non-human factor, because relating to your talk, Mathieu, that we had in the beginning, when you showed the slide also on the availability of fossil fuels and the dependency on fossil fuels, and should we change the narrative much more also on the availability of the renewable sources? Because you don't hear it so much actually, but it's if we were able to capture all the wind and solar energy available on a planetary scale, we could fulfill like 10 times our supply. Yeah, in a sense, and that's not clear, I think, or that's not maybe not so clear if we keep on talking about our dependency on the fossil fuels. So if we were to be dependent, maybe we need to challenge also innovation much more to go beyond raw material dependencies from which creates other problems.
You're absolutely right. So I guess two things. Availability, of course, wind, the wind is everywhere in the world, the sunshine. Of course, there's the technical issue of intermittency. The wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine, and especially for seasonal storage, there are still issues there that haven't been technically solved yet, but it's true. I mean, it's far more accessible, the wind and the sun, than fossil fuels are. And then second, and I think that's what I was hinting at with the critical mineral story as well. It's of course one thing that you have the wind and sun available at all times, almost at least. But of course, the materials that you need in order to capture and transform that energy into electricity, of course, is something else. And the critical minerals aren't always available, and there are affordability, financial issues associated with that as well. And as we've been talking about, sustainability issues as well in terms of, you know, how these minerals are mined. But I mean, again, if we take a more aggregate picture and we really put the security issues of a fossil fuel system and we compare it to the security issues with a renewables-based system, then of course the picture is far more positive, again, at an abstract aggregate level than in the former system. Absolutely, yeah. And it is a narrative that could be used indeed. Yeah.
I wonder about a few geographical possibilities. So Amsterdam wants to be a donut city, but of course it relies on a lot of ghost takers for food, for instance. Do you think it is physically possible and desirable that Amsterdam would be self-sufficient in terms of food production by having city agriculture and hydroponics and things like that?
I'm not an expert on the yields of such endeavors, but I think it's highly unlikely to produce enough food. But it's an issue of scale, and it's an interesting issue of scale because it raises the issue of what does local mean, and does local always mean sustainable? Obviously, the whole globalization of food systems has produced large inequalities and large unsustainabilities. But the question is, do we really need to be self-sufficient on the scale of Amsterdam? Or does it simply mean that we do not need to export tons of cheese and meat to other parts of the world that's produced around the region of Amsterdam? I don't know, maybe the city of Amsterdam has also some views on it, but I see there's also maybe another reaction, or is it...
Yeah. To that? Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm Singaporean. And so this is a huge question. Just to your point, this is the question that actually the government of Singapore is looking at. They're coming to the conclusion that it's not possible simply because land mass requires you to actually account for the needs of the people. The city is planning to expand, but that's still not going to be able to feed everybody, because then, like in the Netherlands, you actually have to create folders and create more land to be able to feed everybody. Buildings will not, provide the same amount of nutritional food. And also things like farms for meat. You can get it from, you can get the stuff you get in labs that they're growing, but it takes a long time and it's expensive, and they're not able to get to that point in the next 5 to 10 years, which is Singapore's goal. So they're still very much dependent on imports from. They're specifying a region for their imports. It's Indonesia and Malaysia primarily, but they're very much like we can't do it without trade. Not possible.
Meino Schmidt at Wageningen University actually has research for this, the efficiency of Dutch agricultural production. And whereas the Netherlands is the second worldwide exporter of foods, he calculated that still we need an energy input, whereas food is being grown with photosynthesis from the sun. So if you would produce food in highly technological ways, then you need still the input of energy, the input of technologies, the input of resources. So you might be self-sustainable in terms of food, but not self-sustainable in terms of other resources.
Did Singapore then take into account what would happen if you would integrate green vegetation in buildings, like green walls and roofs? Yeah, they did. Yeah.
Green walls have been, I mean, maybe you know better than I do, but the last time I read, green walls not exactly the most efficient way of growing anything, especially when it comes to food, given the weight, but also given the nutrition needs of plants themselves. But you know, also building on top of buildings also has its limitations in terms of space, but also and Singapore is an island, like the Netherlands is also sinking. We can't afford the extra weight of those things on top of buildings. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I think we maybe have time for one more other question, and then there'll be maybe the speakers stay around. Or you want to add?
Yeah, can I have a quick response? Because I think the question of does it yield enough production in terms of food is a very relevant one, but it is also about these other questions. What do we expect from food systems? So even if it doesn't produce enough, then it could still be very valuable for health reasons or social cultural reasons, and maybe also for production economic reasons to have at least some part of self-sufficiency in cities. But on the other hand, it might also be that in terms of values for the landscape, for instance, we want different types of agriculture than big buildings with photoponics. So it's a bit of a complex answer for you.
Yeah, just getting back to the geopolitics, and I'm Brazilian, just to be very clear. And recently, the President Lula referred to European Commission as ambassadors of new colonialism, green new colonialism, to be precise. In this discussion about food, I think it's very interesting because why does Europe want to be sustainable or self-reliant in food systems using the sustainability narrative when it's okay to import the batteries that has child labor, slavery, environmental degradation in Congo, Latin America, or textiles from Southeast Asia? So why we don't, sorry for my French, but cut the crap? I mean, this is really a big geopolitical game. And we talk about incumbents as Shell or companies, but there are also governments, countries, they are incumbents in this, let's say, development pathway that we have that is not sustainable for 10 billion people.
I mean, I think if we have to talk about the hypocrisy of the European Commission, it's historically, I mean, wholeheartedly agree. And I guess if I could give you one example about a country in the global south, you know, voicing these types of concerns, I was talking to a Eurocrat, I think it was last year at a conference, and I raised that issue because there was an academic there who had written this paper on Latin America. And he said, and he was saying, he wrote this paper on the carbon budget, and basically he said, well, you know, in this country, X amount of natural gas needs to stay in the ground in order to meet the climate objectives of the Paris Agreement. In that country, X amount. And I asked him a question, so if you go with these findings and you go to a government in, say, for example, Guyana, where they recently found a lot of oil reserves, and you tell them X amount of reserves have to stay in the ground, what do they tell you? Said, well, you know, I'm an academic. Okay, yeah. So afterwards, there's this Eurocrat from the Commission that comes to me, and he says, well, you know what we call this problem? We call it the Uganda problem. In Uganda, they have a lot of oil reserves or resources as well, and the country really wants to develop it. And so at one point, I don't know which European commissioner it was, picks up the phone and wants to tell the Ugandan government, the Minister of Energy, can you keep it in the ground? Because, you know, there's all and the guy basically just said, and pardon my French, fuck off. As long as you guys continue to burn it, we're going to try to develop our natural resources, of course. And I guess to a certain extent, they have a point, because what is their alternative? If there is no alternative offered other than structural adjustment programs, including austerity and whatnot, by the Europeans and by the West, the global North that comes in and tells them, keep it in the ground, then of course they're going to continue to develop it, also knowing full well that in other countries, they're far less scrupulous and they're just going to continue to consume their money. So yeah, absolutely, something has to be.
It's also our consumption, right? It's our consumption pattern as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's
that's what it is.
sense of hypocrisy as well.
That's true. Yeah.
Considerations, absolutely.
Chris, final word.
Perfect answer.
Okay, well, my final word is just from the Rodman's publication. So we looked at all the 10 transitions. He said for the one solution for a circular transition would be a spatial transition in covering the space in 50 by 50 kilometer square areas in which you can have circular patterns, circular industry, and all just transitions happening. And then maybe with a small percentage of like international travel in between, or interregional travel between one. But it's a model, of course, and it's part of a solution of multiple transition and transition pathways. Yeah. Okay, I want to have a big hand for both speakers. Yeah. This concludes the second lecture series. So I invite you to come to our next lecture events in the coming 2 weeks. The next one will be biodiversity loss and landscape management. One of the speakers is already on the first row here. And and I also want to pay your attention to in 2 days, we're going to start a communication about our workshop series. Workshop series are on the road to COP28. We are in this series, we're going to organize 2 workshops to come up with narratives to support from different sorts, from scientists, from artists, from all kinds of professionals working in this field to come help us to bring up stories. We work with narrative experts also from our own university to come up with a group message, and we have also connection with IUCN also to get a stage at COP28. So thank you again, and see you next time.